That was the opposition's view. For the government's take on the issue, I was joined a short time ago by the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen. Chris Bowen, is the fact that Tony Abbott and his senior leadership team were granted a meeting in Indonesia with senior leadership there an indication that the Indonesians believe that they are going to be dealing with an Abbott government in the near future?
No, the Indonesian government extended the opposition the normal courtesies that go to an opposition leader visiting another country. But Tony Abbott had an opportunity here to raise what he says is the cornerstone of his policy, turning back the boats. He squibbed it. He's a lion in Canberra and a mouse in Jakarta when it comes to what he says is a core policy of turning back the boats. Now, he said in the past that he'd do it regardless of what Indonesia says. Now he says he'd workshop it with Indonesia, but he failed to workshop it with Indonesia. And the reason he did that is because he knows President Yudhoyono would have said, not interested. It would have been of great embarrassment to him. So he chose to squib it, which underlines that the fact that his policy is ill thought out and will never be implemented.
But the Shadow Foreign Minister and the Shadow Immigration Minister raised it with Marty Natalegawa, their counterpart. It's common practice in diplomatic areas to have the details nutted out at a lower level.
Well, yeah, but Tony Abbott didn't even raise this with President Yudhoyono, and as the alternative Prime Minister for a policy that he constantly talks about in Australia, to fail to even mention it in his meeting with the head of the Indonesian government is a terrible indictment.
It's accurate to say, isn't it, that the asylum seeker policy that you announced in August has not yet acted as any sort of deterrent to people trying to come to Australia via boat?
Well, I think there's a few challenges here, Lee, and
few challenges. Come on.
Well, let's go through a couple of points. Firstly, yes, people smugglers are out there counter-spinning, saying, look, this policy is not going to be implemented fully. You won't be on Nauru for long. You probably won't be sent to Nauru. So they're out there counter-spinning. That's a fact, and we've got a task to counteract that, and we need to continue and increase our communication efforts, and we're doing that. Secondly, we need to show via the experience of this policy that they're wrong. We need to continue to transfer people to Nauru. We're doing that, and we're increasing the tempo of those transfers, and we need to make crystal clear our policy of no advantage by arriving by boat, by implementing it and showing our resolve. That is the best way that we can combat people smuggling, and that will take some time. And the third point and final point I'd make on this, Lee, is that I've said consistently for 2 years now that something as simple as just doing Nauru or Manus Island by itself would not be the whole story. You need to implement a whole suite of measures, all the recommendations of the Houston report. It's a bit ironic to see Mr Abbott and Mr Morrison jumping out up and down saying, look, Nauru and Manus Island aren't working. We're the ones who've made the point consistently and repeatedly that you need to implement all the measures, including things like the Malaysia Agreement, including increasing our refugee intake to 20,000, which we've done and which I'll be announcing more details about shortly.
I'll come to some questions about that full suite matter in a moment, but the reality is you've announced some things, so you'd expect to see some progress, but everything is trending in the wrong direction. The numbers continue to go up, not down.
Well, we are seeing those challenges, Lee. We've seen some steps forward. We've returned over 40 people to Sri Lanka, for example. You'll say, well, 40 is a small number compared to the arrivals. That's a reasonable point to make, but I would say that's a lot more than we've seen previously in terms of voluntary returns to Sri Lanka. And I think that's underlining the point that I made before. When people are actually seeing this policy being implemented, they're making different decisions, and that will need to continue.
But you've got the problem, haven't you, that because Nauru and Manus are basically already full because of the number of arrivals you've had coming to Australia, the effectiveness of those options as a deterrent is already over.
Oh, no, I don't necessarily accept that full premise, but we do have to obviously manage these arrivals in terms of our implementation of the no advantage test.
How is it still a deterrent if they're already full and people know they are coming to Australia?
Well, I'll be making it clear that we will continue to transfer people to Nauru and Manus Island. Very soon we'll have our first transfer to Manus Island.
4,000 plus people, because that's how many people are in limbo now in Australia.
Well, Lee, of course, we have to implement this report's recommendations against the challenge. I agree with you. It's a challenge that we've had these arrivals and we'll continue to have arrivals, and we'll need to manage that, and I'll obviously say more about that as we go. But the important point now is that we need to continue to show the resolve of these transfers to Nauru, that we will implement the no advantage test, that people who come to Australia by boat won't be advantaged over those many hundreds of thousands and millions of people who are in camps around the world who would love the chance for resettlement in Australia but can't afford a people smuggler.
I just want to pick you up there on this question of no advantage. Today, before a Senate committee, the President of the Human Rights Commission has said that the no advantage principle is an abstract concept without legal meaning.
Well, she also said, I noted that offshore processing was consistent with our international obligations, which is contradictory to what a lot of other people have said, but I've always argued that.
Sure, but address this no advantage.
Sure. Well, to argue against the no advantage principle is to say that you believe that people who can afford to come by boat to Australia should be advantaged over those millions of people who can't afford to come to Australia by boat, and I completely reject that premise.
I don't think that that is the premise. I think the premise is that there's no benchmark by which to judge this no advantage principle.
Well, we'll, as I've said before, we'll work with our posts in the region to ensure that we have benchmarks which would indicate, and I've said before, it's not a one size fits all, it's a case by case approach. We'll look at people's individual circumstances and make an assessment as to when they would have stood the opportunity to get resettled into Australia under that test.
With the people who are currently in Australia in limbo who've come in after August, you are going to have to start processing some of them in Australia, aren't you?
Well, I'll be making obviously further updates and further announcements about how we're managing that. But
you can do it right here now.
Well, I'm not going to announce it on your show tonight, Lee, but what I've said is that the law is clear. You arrive in Australia after August 13, the law says you get transferred offshore to another country, and we're implementing that. And yes, there are challenges. Yes, we need to manage that implementation of the no advantage test. We'll see people moving through, no doubt, Nauru and Manus Island, and some people going home and more capacity being created. All those things will go into how we manage this.
In the 5 years that Labor's been in power, so far close to 26,000 people have arrived by boat. In the entire 11 years of the Howard government, only 14,000 or so people arrived. Is it logical then to say that the old raft of policies were more effective at stopping the boats than the current raft of policies are?
As I say, we're introducing Nauru and Manus Island. In relation to the other two policies, turn back the boats, we've talked about that, how unworkable that is, and they didn't even have the guts to raise it with Indonesia. And temporary protection visas. Well, you're asking about Howard government policies. And I'm answering your question,
You've moved the goalposts. I pointed to the numbers that have come since you've been in power, the numbers that came when the Howard government was in power.
And you asked me about Howard government policies.
Clearly their policies are more effective, looking just at the numbers, than what your policies have been.
Well, you asked me about Howard government policies, and I'm running through them
one by one. So they're more effective?
And I'm running through them one by one.
More effective based on the numbers?
No, and let's look at temporary protection visas as well. How would temporary protection visas work? We are saying you will stay in an offshore place, Manus Island or Nauru, until you would have received a visa if you hadn't come by boat. Now, is the opposition saying they would bring people back to Australia earlier than that and give them temporary protection visas? That they wouldn't implement the no advantage test? Is that how they propose a deterrent? Well, that's not going to work. Are they saying, no, we'll leave you there that long and then give you a temporary protection visa? Is that in keeping with the principles that this nation should be adopting? Look, really, we're implementing the recommendations, all the recommendations. We're the only ones not cherry-picking the recommendations of the Houston Review, which was a very well thought out and considered policy. Obviously, we've been working for a long time. We could have had Nauru and Malaysia and Manus Island all up and running 12 months ago. There were offers made in good faith to the opposition. We've had to find other ways to do it, including appointing the Houston panel and getting the legislation through. We're getting on with the job with the authority given to us by the Parliament, and we are implementing, with all the authority that we can gain from the Parliament, all those recommendations.
Chris Bowen, thank you very much.
Thank you.